He saw the old man looking at him during dinner, and it was unusual. It was more than a conversational look. He was really looking at him, kind of funny. And he didn't think much more of it, but after dinner, as the young girls were clearing the table, the old man said to him, "Come out on the porch for a minute, I want to talk to you." So they went out. And the old man said, "You okay these days?" He said, "Yeah." "Things okay at home and everything?" "Yeah." "With my daughter and so on, everything all right there?" "Uh-huh." "I don't mean to pry or anything, but have you ever heard of PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder? Have you ever heard of that?" No, I haven't really, because I know that you've been through some things. You used to live in Pharaoh's household, and you weren't exactly an Egyptian, and you were raised by your mother, but Pharaoh's daughter didn't know, and that's got to do something to you after a while. And it's often said that later on, when you get thinking about it in your life, things come out and you start seeing things and feeling things. And anything like that happen to you? And the young man said, I don't think so." "Why?" "Well, we've been hearing stories about you." The old man said, "Stories? They're just stories, but they sounded kind of crazy. You were telling somebody that you saw a bush that was burning, but it wasn't consumed. Flames and green, they don't go together. And that you heard voices in the silence, and that you were seen by others making wild gestures in the air, grinning and smiling all over your face, falling down to your knees. And then you took your sandals off in the middle of the thorns and briars, and there you were dancing around the sharp-cut stones. And look at your feet. You need your feet for tending the sheep. I mean, come on. And then sitting at the table, you've been talking about overthrowing the government. I mean, this is called terrorism where we live. It says you're being radicalized where we live, and we just like you, well, as a family, to stop doing that, because I'm a priest, for God's sakes, and I've got people looking at me sideways as well. So just let the big people handle the big issues and stop talking about this stuff, for goodness sakes. Well, there goes our sense of spiritual awakening, isn't it? A small seed germinating in us after such a long hibernation, and a waking little niggle in us that will not go away, and moments that connect things, and we begin to sense deep inside, just a little sense, that we are being prepared for something, and we're being renovated for something in this time. But then those closest to us begin to doubt. "Oh dear, don't tell me you're going to handle those texts again. Do you have to go to the meeting? You're always at meetings, dear." And those who are near us criticize us, and those around us look on us as sort of hopeless. There are those funny people telling those funny stories, and they don't add up to anything. I remember in a former congregation sitting at a board meeting one night, and about 20 people around the room, and suddenly a woman got up and started taking me apart, bone by bone. She said, "You know, we're all starving to death out here because you're our minister. Every Sunday morning you open the text, and we know it's going to be absolutely vacuous. And the time you spend with the children, oh, it is so trite and facile." Well, I tried to be Rogerian from my memories of Psychology 101, and I said, "What I hear you saying is that you think I stink." And then I felt I was going to cry, and I didn't want to do that in front of my board, so I drove home, and I remember filling the sink in the kitchen with hot water and putting dish soap in it and putting my elbows in it right up to my shoulders and feeling the warmth of the water around me. And then my wife held me in her arms, and then I cried. The Contagious Joy of Preaching. It's a great title, isn't it? Until the culture picks it apart and the critics mock it and the Times ignore it. We feel ourselves away out there dancing on the end of a non-existent limb. Now, many preachers feel the challenge of preaching, that's for sure, and the weight of preaching, and the complexity of preaching, and even the crisis of preaching, but I don't think many people feel the joy of preaching all the time. And I think many congregations may feel the routine of preaching and the necessity of polite listening to preaching and the hope for a morsel or two from preaching, but not the contagion of it. Is that true? On a few starkly memorable occasions, I have felt the gripping terror of preaching. Sitting in the front seat, bad idea, at Fourth Presbyterian Church in Chicago, Illinois, and listening to James Forbes Jr. preach. I never saw a minister catch fire, glow incandescently with a white light, and burn to ash right in front of me, but James Forbes did it that day. "I need you to pray up the preacher," he said, and we did. And then he burned to the ground right in front of us. And I remember holding on to the pew in front of me so hard that my knuckles were white and I could not extricate my fingers from the shape they were in. And my only feeling was, please God, don't let him see me sitting here. Don't let him see me. And I've heard the masterful wizardry of preaching. In Cameron Hall, just along the hall, years ago, I heard Dr. Morris Boyd open the text, "Art is a house that longs to be haunted." Oh, what a magnificent Irish preacher he was. I hated him. And I loved him so much, and he is still one of my great preaching heroes. And I've heard the dexterous weaving of preaching, Barbara Brown Taylor in her soft and exquisite voice, telling us that Lazarus was at the table, but they'd only given him a spoon because he couldn't handle a knife and fork yet. He had been back to life for such a short time. What a remarkable insight. Where did that come from, I said to myself. And the cat-like playfulness of preaching, Fred Craddock. Preaching from this pulpit one day, he said, "Well, you notice a big difference in me since I was here last time. I've retired, and I've had to change my glasses because with my old ones I could see right through my students." And I even heard the sainted preaching of James S. Stewart, who was considered the greatest preacher of the 20th century. Stewart of New College, Edinburgh, Stewart of Morningside. I heard him 5 Sunday nights in a row at St. George's West Church in Edinburgh when he was 85 years old. He read the scripture in a very wooden way, and I remember saying to myself, oh dear, I've missed him. And then he preached with such magnificence, I never forgot. And of course, I've heard many lesser things as well, all of us have. We take a bowl with us, a large bowl of expectation to the church on a Sunday, and a morsel or two gets dropped into it, and we try to taste it when we get home, and it's either gone stale in the car, or it doesn't taste very good at all. So we take a smaller bowl the next week, and a couple more little morsels drop in, and they're not much better, and then a smaller bowl, and finally we take a little plastic bag, and then finally we don't go quite as often, and then we don't go at all. My wife left me, well, she was going back to Canada. I was on my way to Iona for 6 weeks, and we were in London, and she left on a Saturday, and as soon as she left, I burst into tears. Suddenly, I'm all alone in a metropolis on the far side of the world. And so I thought, I've got a Sunday to put in before I take the plane to Glasgow and the train to Iona. And so what shall I do? Well, go to church. That's the default position for clergy, go to church. So I went to Westminster Abbey for the sung morning prayer, morning song, and I sat up at the front near where the Queen sat when the royal wedding happened. And then after hearing the beautiful and wonderful liturgy, I actually said to myself, I wish I were dead in here. Because like all the kings and queens, the liturgy happens all the time, and it settles on you like a tea cozy, and the cozy lifts up and you're all brewed. And it's lovely. And then I realized I've got to get across the street to Westminster Central Hall to hear the Methodists. So I left in the middle of the service, which didn't go over too big, and I was 35 minutes early for Westminster Central Hall, and they were testing the microphones. What a come down. I can't hear you, Bill. Speak up. Testing. 1, 2, 3, Bill. I'd just been at Westminster Abbey hearing morning choral, morning prayer and Eucharist. Can't hear you, Bill. Speak up, Bill. And then the clergy came in all dressed in suits, and the choir came in all dressed in robes, and I said it's one way or the other. And then the service was underwhelming. So in the afternoon I went to St. Paul's, and I heard the afternoon service, and the choir was so muffled in that great space that every word bounced off every other word. And the guest minister who preached in a way that his own voice echoed back on him like a roaring crowd. "The Lord loves you," said the voice. I think the attendance at the Anglican Church is dropping considerably in Britain. And then I went to Bloomsbury Baptist Church in the evening and joined the 40 people and got back to my room exhausted and churched out at 9:30, but we got through it. For us to start with the presumption of contagious joy is like standing somehow at the heart of a tragedy and blurting out the phrase, "It's okay, folks, Christ is risen." That would be totally and utterly unacceptable. In the face of traffic deaths on the street or targeted shootings in the alleys or raging fires in California or the march of refugees across the world, "It's okay, folks, Christ is risen," doesn't really fit. There's no contagious joy in that. The phrase "Christ is risen" is an affirmation that comes to us after long years of the divine revelation at work in our lives. Christ is risen is the anchorage on which we stand. It is something we say to those intimate and close to us who share the revelation. At some point, we must back up to the acknowledgement of the chronic pain of living. Everyone we ever meet has pain, everyone. And when you look out at your congregation on Sunday morning, underneath those Sunday smiles, somebody is suffering from bereavement, and somebody has a broken heart, and somebody knows what social oppression is, and somebody knows what gender discrimination is, and somebody is living under the power of life guilt. I met a woman one time I'd known for years in a social club, and she ended up being at a cottage near us, and she was 80 years old, and she walked along the street with her cane one morning and came to the cottage door, and there she was. We had a cup of coffee together, and she said to me, do you know that I have felt depression all my life, battled depression all my life? I said, no, I didn't know that. I knew her as a theater person, someone very bright and interesting. She said, there have been days, the number of which I can count on my hand, that my days started at zero. All the other days were below zero, and I had to work up to zero if I were very fortunate. Everyone knows the chronic pain of living. And preachers are affected by the chronic pain of living too. Years ago, we went to Kirkridge, and we had a quick draw preaching event, which was quite wonderful. They put a text in an envelope on the kitchen door at noon, and by 4 o'clock you have to come back with an 8-minute sermon, and you preach to your peers and one of the leaders, and the text was a dirty stinker. It was from Psalm 88. My soul is all trouble, my life is on the brink. I am numbered among those who go to Sheol, down to the pit, a life bereft of strength, wretched, slowly dying. Since my youth I bore your terrors, and now I am exhausted. Give them 8 minutes of that and see what that's like. Well, there was an American preacher there, and he had his pants all nicely ironed, and you could slice bread on the crease, and he looked really terrific, and he came in with that wonderful southern smile, and he began to open up the text, and soon a whole other sermon was coming out of his body. His mouth said one thing, and his body said, I'm terrified of death, I'm terrified of cancer, I'm terrified of pastoral care, and I really don't want to deal with this text or with the ministry at all. I'd never seen such a dualistic sermon proceed at once. All of us are affected by the chronic pain of living, clergy or lay. To reach the contagious joy of preaching, we must address the spirit of cultural doubt. We all know that the strong train of organized religion pulled out of the train station about 2 generations ago, and it's been patch ever since. We are all moved by the story at the basis of Jesus Christ. That is a human thing. It's called the monomyth. A person goes out from a small village somewhere, goes into a world which is beyond the world he knows. There he experiences extraterrestrial and supernatural and ordinary things, and he wrestles for a boon, and he wins it by hook or by crook, and he brings it back and he shares it with those whom he loves. That's the gospel. That's the Jesus' story, that's called the monomyth. Every culture in the world tells the story, and we as a people, as a culture, still believe in it in our movies and in our books. Star Wars is about it, Robin Hood is about it, the movie Gladiator is about it, Saving Private Ryan is about it. Tell me I've lived a good life, says the man at the end of the movie, and I burst into tears in the theater. Isn't that what we're asking? Tell me I've lived a good life. I've cried twice in the theater out loud. It's a little embarrassing. That was one of the times my son was sitting beside me, and the other was watching the movie Sense and Sensibility, where at the very end of it, Emma Thompson, who thinks she's lost the love of her life, is suddenly confronted by Hugh Grant, her lover, who returns and says, "How could I ever leave you? You've been the love of my life." I burst into tears. My son moved over about 7 seats, and he didn't speak to me for about a week and a half, but we're all moved by this deep story of transformation. You go out against the world and you win the prize, and you come back and share it with those whom you love. Is that not what the resurrection of the Messiah is about at its heart? It's authentic to say that the times have vastly changed for us in the church. We know it, we live it. Somebody said of the United Church of Canada that we are now living as a humus generation. A humus generation. There are little unknown seeds growing in it. I don't want to be part of a humus generation. I want to be part of a full flower generation. Great sunflowers with bursting seeds and smiles on their faces. Not going to happen. We are humbled. We are being driven to regroup. And some people resist like fighters to the very end. No one's going to take this from us, and some people hold the fort to the very end, even change the message, we say, as long as we survive, and others desperately try to turn the prow of the ship into the oncoming wave. It is essential to say that we're all being humbled in an era of secular aspirations going sour, and even those who hoped for this culture in its secular life are being disappointed. Out of pride comes racism all of a sudden, and out of patriotism comes imperialism all of a sudden, and out of sanctity comes entitlement all of a sudden. There is still a quest, however, there is still a quest for a truth beyond the lies and for meaning beyond the drift. I remember going to a very dull meeting of a social club one time, and I was to sing the Constitution. It had been written by Healy Willan, and it was sung like Anglican plain chant. This club shall consist of a president, and there'll be several others who are involved. Amen. And I was waiting to sing it. I wasn't staying for the dinner, just going to sing the thing. And they did all the reports from all the committees ahead of that. So I was slowly drifting off by report number 25, and it was from the book table. And the man stood up and said, "Before I make my report, I want to say one thing to you. Everyone has a book in him or her." Well, suddenly I was wide awake. "But we're afraid to publish it because people may laugh at us or mock us or think little of us." Indeed, he illustrated that 2 very famous writers kept manuscripts in their desk drawers for years, lest their mother see what they had written. "Tell them what you found," he said. "Everyone wants to know what you found. We haven't been this way before. Just tell them what you've..." Is that not the beginning of a great conversation? Truth beyond the lies, meaning beyond the drift. Now, to cross the gap between the shale of our tideless beach and the headlands of contagious joy, we must face the dull ache of despair. The global warming floods the shoreline of our church lives. The spaces on which we stand seem smaller, and the storms seem to be increasing in intensity. I remember Ernest Campbell, one of the great ministers at the Riverside Church, one time years ago saying, "Here is the weather report for the churches, mostly cloudy with occasional patches of blue. And here is what time it is in the west," he said. "Late afternoon, morning is rising in the east," he said. We are all gripped by the noonday demon of which was spoken yesterday, the distraction of peripheral things, lest we find the primary things basically unhelpful. And all of us face the enemy of death, the ultimate last enemy. All of us are passing through this life and our mortality is in front of us every day. There is a time to be born and a time to die. But the contagious joy of preaching is real. It is the fruit of a well-planted seed of God, a seed ready to explode even in the face of our mortal ends. I had a dear friend in the congregation. She had seen her husband through Alzheimer's disease until he died, and then she herself developed a cancer, and we spent time together. She was a great friend. She was someone who would make me a pumpkin pie every year for Canadian Thanksgiving, and even in her late illness, she would find herself in the kitchen. She said, "I made you 6 pumpkin pies and froze them for the years when I will no longer be here." Isn't that a wonderful gesture? Well, we sat together at the hospice in which she died outside. It was a lovely spring morning, and we were looking up at the trees, and she said, "Look at the greenery at the top of those branches. They're just ready to pop. All they need is a brilliant rain and a blaze of sun, and new life will spring from them." 2 or 3 days later, I was sitting at home thinking my thoughts, and suddenly the sky grew very dark outside the apartment windows, one of those pea-green black darknesses. And then the heavens opened and the rain beat torrentially upon the window panes. And then it was gone in a brief moment. And then the sun blazed, and you could feel the heat through the windows burning off the water. And I said to myself, Ruth has just died. She just died. And within 2 minutes, her son called from the hospice and saying, "Mom passed away a few minutes ago." And I saw the contagious joy of our preaching together coming to life even in the face of our mortality. Well, the news at the heart of faith is that life in God still triumphs over death in life. The deep archetype of rescue from slavery seen in the Old Testament story is the same archetype as Christ is risen from the dead. It's the same news. The contagious joy of preaching is a child of life contagion. Surprise, amazement, and revelation when they come. Have you seen it? I have. There was an engineer in my congregation, the head of our property committee for years, a crusty old fellow. He had the keys to the door, and he made sure that he was the one who opened and closed them. The one bright spot in his life was his dear wife, whom he had married as a university sweetheart. She became ill, and she died. He was lost for a year or so, wandering around, not knowing what to do with himself. One day he said, "I received a flyer from an engineering magazine to which I belong. There's an engineering conference in Lincoln Cathedral in England, and my son lives in Lincoln, so maybe I'll go, and I might as well." And so he planned to go, and he came to me a few days before the flight. He said, "I've got the funniest feeling about this trip." I said, "You mean the plane is going to crash?" No, he said, "just a funny feeling." I said, "Well, tell me about it when you come home." So back he came. He said, "Well, I went and saw my son, that was okay, and then I went to the cathedral and I told them who I was and that I was from Canada, and they introduced me to the woman who was organizing the event, and when she turned around, she was the spitting image of my late wife, absolutely a ringer for my late wife. And she talked to me for about 10 minutes, and I was absolutely blank, and finally she said, 'Are you all right?' And he said, 'I'm not all right at all.' And he showed her pictures on his laptop computer of his late wife, and the dean of the cathedral walked by and looked at them and said, 'Oh my God.' Well, the woman said, 'Would you please bring these pictures to my house tomorrow and show my husband? He will be very interested to see them.' So the next morning, my friend phoned the house, and the husband said, 'I'm so glad you called. I need to tell you that my wife died last night.' She had been very ill for a long time, but felt that she needed to go to the cathedral. And she said, 'When I saw his face, I knew that was the reason.' Now, we're having a ceremony here next week, and my daughter's coming up, but she will be back in London in 10 days. Would you mind having dinner with her in London if you're going to be there?" So 10 days later, up from the tube came this most beautiful young woman he said was the spitting image of his wife at university days. And they sat at dinner, and at the end of the dinner, the woman said, "My mother gave a message to my father for you. Anyone who is loved as you have loved is going to be all right." He said, "I felt like $1,000,000. Later on, I said to him, "What do you make of it?" He said, "Well, I've seen it 3 times in my life. I saw it and felt it. when I turned around in the line at Varsity Stadium years ago and I saw my to-be wife standing in line, and I said to myself, that's the girl I'm going to marry. And then later, when our son was killed in a boating accident and we gathered at the funeral home among his friends, she caught my eye across the room and smiled, and I knew we'd be all right. And the third time was meeting that woman in the cathedral. I said, what do you think it is? He said, I think it's the love of God. Ah, the contagious joy of preaching.